Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick, and with me, as is the case every single episode, is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, let's get right back into it. We're talking Genesis 2:16 and 17, and we're talking about this idea of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and of course the prohibition against eating it, and the consequence of that being death. So, what we want to do in this episode is really consider what's the deal with this tree within the context of this narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so to that end, I think we'll begin with a question that I think matters not tremendously importantly, and it's not something that we can know exactly why God did it this way, right? But the question that I think many of us would wonder is why is this tree there? You know, if there was a prohibition against consuming this tree, why did God leave it there for them even to have the potential of consuming
nice.
it, right? Yeah,
it's pretty.
Right. I believe the woman does describe it as pleasing to look at. So perhaps
hey, there we go.
Perhaps you're correct. It was purely for the aesthetics. But again, though, we don't want to speculate really on what God's motive was, but the fact that it is there can tell us a few things about sort of the nature of humanity, right? And I think that the fact of the tree being in the garden represents a few things about what humanity's existence consists of. So to really answer the question of why is it even there, to put it simply, I think the answer is because it is, right? Which is not particularly satisfying, but once I think we look at what the tree represents, I think we get a little more of a satisfactory feeling about the existence of the tree.
I guess the question that people ask is why. This says a lot about how we think about God, because people are not just asking why is it there, but it's there. Or the better answer is it's because God put it there.
Right.
The question that they're really asking is why did God put it there?
Right.
And so we're assuming this. This has a way in which we look at God. We tend to look at God as appropriately as a divine creator, all powerful and capable of structuring reality, however he sees fit to structure it.
Right.
And this is again taking we talked about this last episode, taking the alternate history perspective or the alternate possibility. God could have not put it there.
Right.
And it's like, well, the point of this story is not to tell us how the world could be.
Right.
The idea is to tell us how it is. What are we actually being presented with? And God's illustrating to us, this is how the world is actually presented to you.
Yeah.
So it's not you're not being coy, and you're not being pithy or just writing something off by saying it's there because it's there. That actually does have a lot of depth to it when you say that, because you're saying, look, you're missing the point of the story if you're looking at it from almost an accusatory lens of saying, well, God, why did you put that there?
Right.
It's like, well, you can go down that path, but that's not going to be a really fun path. It's going to be far more beneficial for you to say, okay, it's there, but what does it mean that it is there?
And I think what we'll get to here in a second as we look at it is that asking the question of what does it mean, right? What function, what role does it fill being there? Might actually be the path by which we might have some idea of why God would put it there, right?
You come out the other end. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So if we consider this story, as we've talked about before, as being meant to explain the universality of human sin, so we don't look at it, we've talked about this not as original sin, but as explaining the reason the theory of original sin even exists, which is that for the story of Christ to be what it is, there must be universal sin. And I do think this story does describe the universality of sin, if not some sort of strange genetic passed down component. We talked about that a few episodes ago. So the existence and corresponding prohibition against this tree, I think what this represents really then in terms of the story of universal sin is the idea of humanity's free will, right? So what we see here in this tree is we see humanity not being limited to only that which was fit for them. God didn't simply cut humans off from this possibility of making the wrong choice, right? He actually gave them free will because this tree exists and because we know that they could potentially do wrong with it, hence the necessity for the prohibition. We know that they have free will, right? And similarly, by the way, God offers up a prohibition against it, meaning humanity has the ability to make the wrong choice, right? This is not, no one has to tell the lion not to eat plants, right? No one has to inform the lion of that. The lion can't digest plants and the lion doesn't eat plants. There's no prohibition involved there. It just doesn't do it. You have a prohibition. So there's no having plants around a lion, for instance, aren't a temptation for a lion to do the wrong thing, right? It has no instinct to do that. So you don't need a prohibition. But merely having the tree available in the garden means there is the possibility of doing wrong for humans, and it is tempting. Because we have free will, there's the temptation to do wrong. And so God lets us know that, that's prohibited, right? But the key I think we see in the tree here is the idea that it is God allowing humans the free will and the opportunity to make the wrong choice. That's really what this tree represents, is that we have that choice. We're not mechanical wind-up dolls. We're not lions with no instinct to do the wrong thing. No, we're as free will, as free an opportunity, I guess, as a being could possibly have in terms of the choices available to us.
Yeah. We talked a while back about pruning and about things occupying their function within a garden, and that they will occupy this function of growing in the direction that they're supposed to, and then humans operate this function of cutting back in terms of that.
Yeah.
But there is a single direction that they function, growing in a single direction. That's all that they do. And so this seems to be setting up humans as being given a function and saying, this is the function that you're supposed to serve out. However, you have the option of serving out different functions.
Yes. Yeah.
There may be consequences related to serving out different functions, but you have optionality, which does make you fundamentally different. And that's what you're getting at with free will.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
That's interesting.
Exactly. So that leads us to the next component of this, to discuss why is there a prohibition against this tree, right? What is it about this tree that requires a prohibition against this, right? And again, it's about the opportunity to make the wrong choice, but more importantly, with the wrong choice comes consequences. And we'll talk more about the consequences here for humanity in the next episode, when we really talk about the death component of this all. But it should be noted, if we look at this story as a whole, that the consequences of the wrong choice extend beyond just what happens with humanity. It extends to all of creation. And the reason I say that is, what is happening when you eat of this tree, it's a failure of stewardship that actually harms that which is being stewarded. And the way in which we might see that is that what happens is an expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And in the process of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, remember at the end here, which again, we're looking ahead a little bit, but that's okay. At the end here, the angel that is set by Eden, it doesn't hunt down the man and woman and put them to death and then everything's solved, right? No, the angel stays to guard the garden against the man and the woman, against the corrupting effects of sin. Because the corruption of sin extends beyond just those who commit the sin. And we also see this when the consequences of this are discussed with the man and woman, and in particular to the man in particular, talking about the idea of thorns being now rising up from the ground, and the process of growing being more difficult because the creation has been negatively impacted as a result of the sin. And so that is the reason, I guess, for or part of the reason for the prohibition against this tree, and part of the reason there would be consequences associated with the violation of this prohibition, because the way God's order is designed is such that a failure of stewardship would negatively impact it. And by the way, it makes sense for that to be the case, right? Because otherwise, how is stewardship anything meaningful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stewardship, the role of man as the image of God, it has no meaning if the failure to do it properly doesn't have consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if the failure to do it properly doesn't have consequences, that also means doing it properly doesn't have consequences. Yeah. So if that weren't the way things were set up, then life would truly be meaningless in that way. Correct. Right? But because there is an effect, and because proper stewardship and service of God's order does benefit things or negatively affect things if done incorrectly, now there is a meaning to the life of man.
Yeah. At its fundamental root, meaning does have, the word meaning wrestles with that idea. Then, at least as far as we use it in English, is that when you say, what does that mean? If you present a series of events, you say, what do they mean? You're talking more about causality. You're talking about what is going to happen because of that, or what caused that to happen, all sorts of things like that, dealing with a series of events and causality. But when you say somebody is searching for meaning or wanting meaning, they're saying they want significance, which is far more abstracted in our minds. But
I would argue that
when you boil it back, significance really means that there is some effect by your actions.
Yeah, there is a causality to it.
And so, yeah, exactly. And then because we're humans, we search for more significance and deeper significance to that. What does it even matter that I caused something to happen and stuff like that?
Yeah.
But fundamental to the idea is that the things that you do have effects. And as humans, we want there to be effects.
Right.
We feel perhaps most empty when there aren't effects to the things that we do.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, much depression, anxiety, these things can emerge from a feeling of ineffectualness.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are deeply wrapped up in that. So
exactly. So the causality is important.
Yeah. Okay, returning to the tree here, another interesting little tidbit is there is only a prohibition against this one singular tree, right? Nothing else in the garden is prohibited except the consumption of fruit from this one tree. And I think it's easy to wonder why God would have put only one prohibition on humanity in the garden setting. That sort of strikes me as, that's curious, right? And I think, though, if we think about this, again, symbolically telling the story of universal sin, I think it's actually quite revealing, right? And the first thing, this is the simpler thing, is I think what the lone prohibition here does is demonstrates the inevitability of human sin.
You all had one job.
Yep. In a way, God is
one job, and you couldn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying in this story basically that even if we had just one singular thing to avoid, we would still find a way to screw that up. And if you don't believe that is true, then spend a little time with humans, because I'm fully persuaded by my interactions with humanity, and as well as my own wonderful example, that that's true. Even if there was just one thing, we would find a way to screw that up. So I think that's one of the first things that's being revealed here. But another thing we might be able to take from this lone prohibition, and considering, again, the universal human sin element, is that I think God might be revealing to us that all sin is, in effect, one thing, or stems from one source. So the idea that really all sin is kind of the same in a way. And we'll consider this a bit more actually when we look at the actual temptation and eating of the fruit, because I think there's quite a bit there about the nature of sin as well once we get to those things specifically. But for now, I think that it might be useful to consider the idea of when God is presenting us with a story like this, right? Again, rather than just presenting mere historicity, he is expressing a particular perspective to us, to humanity. And in a way, I think that is partially he is presenting his own perspective and how he sees us and sees who we are, right? And as we'll later see in the Bible, that God treats all manner of sin equivalently, right? In a spiritual sense. One sin, again, no greater than any other sin, and one sin is enough to cut us off from God, right? And I think that perhaps that's because from God's perspective, it is all one thing. And the way this story is expressing that to us is through the fact that there is just the single lone prohibition. So another way we might think about this, again, thinking that this story is spiritually focused, is that sin may take on different material forms, right? But in a spiritual sense, it's a singular failure. It's all the same thing. It's all the same spiritual error. Materially, it looks different. There's a variety of different things, violations of the 10 commandments. Well, there's at least 10 different ways, right? That sin may emerge.
You see this though in Jesus's response to the Pharisees, as he boils down the laws and the prophets to two commandments. Love the Lord God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. It's like offhand he does that down to two. And there's this way in which it's like you see that narrowing process of look, it really is more simple than you think. But because of the chaos that's been instituted in the world in which it is, that
and even there, need to be specified out from the first.
Correct. Correct.
The more you love God, the more you will love your neighbor.
Exactly. So I think it's reasonable to argue that looking at sin through a singular lens, or looking at it as a single entity, makes sense. I think there's other evidence for that as you go through the Bible.
And I think that's one of the things we can see by the lone prohibition here. And then there's a third takeaway as well, and I think this is again, this idea is informed by considering the story as being revelatory of God's perspective, or at least the placing us outside the story. So we get that sort of third party looking down at things perspective, which is akin, I guess, to God's perspective. And it's of course all translated through story, which is the way humans really can understand that which is spiritual. The lone prohibition here reveals to us that in a spiritual sense, righteous living is not a limiting thing. And the reason I think that's important to consider here is to consider that within the context of our associations with morality, and particularly Christian morality. I think we tend at times to see the moral codes associated with Judaism and later Christianity as very limiting, right? For instance, one wife and one sexual partner, right? That's something the rest of the society, particularly in this day and age, they see that as unnecessarily limiting, right? Well, that's no, you don't need to do that, right? Even though that is part of the moral code there. But likewise, if we look at the 10 commandments, we can see that they're built around limitations upon human actions, right? Worship one God, not many. You can't acquire things through theft. So there's a limited way of acceptable ways of acquiring things. You must tell the truth about others. You're limited, you're prevented, you're told not to lie, right? And bear false witness, basically. And in fact, you shouldn't even covet what others have, right? That's how limiting this is. So we tend to think of Christianity as limiting. And actually, I do believe Christian morality is in fact a very limiting moral framework. It is. It's very limiting upon humans. In fact, personally, I don't think I would go quite as far as the Puritans, because I think the roots of their moral perspective was flawed. But I actually see rightfully understood Christianity as being an even more limiting thing than I would argue most church-going Christians really believe it to be. I think even compared to the world looks at the church right now and says you're being too limiting. Truth be told, I think in the modern church, especially, we even now have a sense of morality that is too loose. So I want to point out, I don't think it's wrong to say that Christian morality is meant to be very limiting, because it is. But at the same time, I'm saying that this verse is describing a morality that is not very limiting, right? So the solution to this seeming paradox, I think, is all about the things we've talked about before, the idea of the material and the spiritual. I think Christian morality is indeed materially a very limiting thing. However, I think it is filled with spiritual abundance. And so if we look from the spiritual perspective, we see, as we talked about previously, all sin is one thing. So then in avoiding sin and its effects, though, all we're doing is limiting one thing, and now the spiritual abundance is available to us. So that actually flips this on its head. And the process, I think the process of material limitation, when we do that, we discover much greater things available to us, right? And I'll give a couple examples of this, right? I will say, in a sense, I think any dependence upon material things, I believe that to be a kind of addiction, right? If you're looking to material things for anything beyond material satisfaction, right? Material things can provide material satisfaction, but if you're looking for spiritual satisfaction out of something materially, that's the grounds of addiction, right? It's easy to see that with drugs and alcohol, and that's why programs that are designed around addressing those kind of addictions have a heavy focus on understanding sort of a spiritual element, maybe not Christian specifically, but the idea of a spiritual reality is sort of associated with that, right? But if you talk to any alcoholic or drug addict, right, who is in recovery, and has been for a period of time, they would absolutely describe how a material limitation in their life, no longer partaking in that substance and instituting that discipline, brings about a whole abundance on this richer, deeper spiritual level. You know, they all recognize that and talk about that kind of thing. And so I think that is the reality, is that we too can be addicted to the material nature of sin, whatever it be, right? Again, go to the 10 Commandments if you desire, one of those things. And when we're doing that, we're seeking some sort of spiritual satisfaction out of things, and then we cut ourselves off from the spiritual abundance, right? But I think what these verses here reveal to us, again, looking spiritually, is the idea that discipline is really freedom. Freedom comes from discipline. And if we can avoid partaking of the one tree, then the whole spiritual garden is available to us, right? If we can avoid the sin, the garden is there, right? And the spiritual abundance is there. So I think that's worth thinking about. And obviously, as the Bible continues through, it's through Christ that we are given this opportunity to really avoid the effects of that one tree. And I think if you talk to, again, those who have really found a deep, true connection with Christ, they will surely recognize the thing I'm describing here, how they may, as they build a deeper relationship with him, many things materially become just simply not an option, to the point where they aren't even a consideration, right? The things the world might see you as crazy for not partaking in, you just don't even consider it an option to do. But that deeper relationship leads to and the stronger sense of discipline that comes with it comes to just a daily gain of abundance in a spiritual sense, in a way that I think may even be beyond the capacity of words to describe. But to put it poetically, you feel as though you're returning to the garden, right? I think that is what is captured in there. So in this verse, I see this dynamic of material limitation juxtaposed with spiritual abundance. And that's reflected in the idea of a single tree of prohibition, one spiritual error to avoid, and then the spiritual abundance is available to you. So any takeaways on that? Any thoughts?
I think what's interesting is is what's played out. What lies behind the tree, the prohibited tree, is that the prohibited tree is good to look at, and it was good to eat. That is described as that. What lies behind the prohibited tree, though, is the curse and is thorns and thistles coming up from the ground. And I think that's a good descriptor of what you're getting at, and maybe one of the ways in which all sin bears this similar quality, or is the same thing, in that it is attractive and it is good to eat, but the thing that lies behind it is it doesn't have a staying power that can continue to provide. And that's the difference between that and the way the garden is described, is that there's an abundance of trees that are able to eat and fulfill, whereas this will be attractive and will fulfill you. And if we're playing this out as universality of sin, everyone will eat of it. And then everyone will discover that there's not something behind it. And that might be even, the drug addiction is a good example, but again, this does sit universally. So it can be, you can take any example and it tends to play out almost in the same pattern. I guess
I think the drug addiction is the extreme, but it's the extreme that
very visual. Very visual.
It reveals what's kind of there for all of us, though, right? We all become addicted to, let's call it, poor stewardship, right? Material use that is outside of God's order of things, right? And there are things that we all desire on that front, right? But what we're doing there often is trying to satisfy, search for a spiritual answer with some sort of material thing, right? And that sort of leads to that addiction to it. Because if you go ahead.
If you talk about it in investing terms, it provides high returns immediately, and then it diminishes right away.
Yes.
Following, as you continue to go back to it, whatever it is, it doesn't.
But you still see
doesn't have sustainability. Return. Exactly. Exactly. That's the pattern that plays out over and over again. And drugs are just a very easy example of that. But if you play it out in a lot of other examples, it's going to be the extreme end of the spectrum,
for sure. But they are on a spectrum that there are many things that I would argue people in the church today consider to be harmless that are in fact a part of this negative pattern.
Correct. Correct.
All right. So with all that in mind, I think we'll move on. Next episode, we're going to talk about, we're going to get even more bleak, I guess, as we talk about death. We will discuss the consequences of the violation of this prohibition and sort of why they're there and what it all represents. But of course, as bleak as it gets, thankfully we have the New Testament, though, so we have the corresponding hope, I guess, that that goes with the bleakness and darkness of elements we see presented here. So until then, be sure to follow us, like, subscribe, all of those things, notification bells, email us unschooled theology@protonmail.com, and we will catch you in the next one.